Dan is one of the greatest experts in philosophy of mind, philosophy on neuroscience, philosophy of biology, metaphysics, epistemology, and you mention as many as you want. Okay, so today then we'll talk about the role of consciousness in self-control, and you have the floor. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Dan.
Mario, thank you. It's a pleasure to see friends and colleagues. So consciousness is very much in the academic news these days, books coming out all the time. And there's a lot of confusion. Well, let's see now. Please move. Don't tell me. My slide isn't advancing. Help.
Before it works.
There you go. Okay. I found a new place to click. I guess everybody's familiar with David Chalmers' account of the hard problem. I remember once in Tucson walking in a park with David Rosenthal and David Chalmers. And Rosenthal said to Chalmers, David, I like your easy problems, hard problem distinction, except for one thing. And Chalmers said, what's that? He says, you got the names confused. It's the other way around. This is the easy problem and the hard problems. And I think that's basically right. And that's one of the themes of my talk today. So how do you get to the hard problem? You get to the hard problem by stopping too early. First of all, if you're a scientist, you concentrate on the inbound paths and think of all we've learned in the last 30 years about visual areas and different cortical pathways, different models of how all of the material coming in, let's just talk about vision, how it gets sorted out and goes through these different cortical maps. So we've done a tremendous job on the inbound paths. And that's what people have worked on until you've explained roughly how the information or contents gets to consciousness, or as some would say, to the NCC, the neural correlates of consciousness. You were supposed to identify these as, when you get there, that's consciousness. But when you got there, you declare victory and hand the rest of the job to the philosophers. From here on, it's their job, because once we get to consciousness, we get to what everybody is themselves the best authority on, namely their own consciousness. And what's the point of third-person science once we've got there? Well, this is just a breathtaking mistake, because it's just half of what a theory of consciousness must explain. Some years ago, actually a few years before Chalmers wrote about the hard problem, I wrote about the hard question, which is, and then what happens? Okay, so something has reached whatever you take the neural correlates of consciousness to be, now what? And then what happens? The effects of becoming conscious of something are important. It is very important. They are innumerable, in a way I will explain. And the physical mechanisms responsible is just as inaccessible to you as the mechanisms on the upward path. That is to say, you have no introspective access to the breakdown of the signals coming from the retina through the many different retinotopic maps, even the optic chiasm and the crossover between left and right. You have no direct knowledge of that. That takes third-person science to discover that. And what I'm saying is the physical mechanisms responsible for what happens next are just as inaccessible to you. You have no idea how you do it or what happens. And those questions have to be answered one way or another. And that's, those are Chalmers' easy questions. I say they're the hard questions. I'm going to give an example which is now quite dated, but it makes perhaps the central point I want to make. And this is a task called word stem completion. Okay, I show you a word stem, FRI, with a blank. And I say, think of a word to complete that stem. So everybody just holler out a word. I guess you have your
Right.
mute. Excuse me?
Friday.
Okay, good. You get the idea. So you're a subject in an experiment, and you're seeing lots of these word stems, and the idea is to simply finish them in one way or another. Now, the likelihood that you will say frightened instead of, say, friend or frigid or frippery or whatever is raised if before you see the stem, you see what's called a masked prime. And a masked prime is a word that comes on before you see the stem, but is immediately masked with a random pattern mask. And if you do this right, you're not aware of having seen that word at all. You have no sense that you've seen a prime. Suppose the prime was scared. If the prime was scared, the likelihood that you would say frightened rather than friend or frigid, the likelihood would be raised significantly. That's a well-established result. The key, however, is the latency of the mask. And let me explain that simply. This is work by Dennett and Jacobi, and it was way back in '94. So here's the task. Subjects are shown, say, the word scared. Then after a very brief interval, there's a mask. And then after another brief interval, there's FRI and the task to be completed. Well, Dennett and Jacobi did this in sort of three different, actually more than three different timings. In the second timing, where you see there's a longer latency between the prime and the mask, if you do that, then the mask doesn't work and people see the word and they can say, what did you see? I saw the word scared, then I saw a little flicker of a mask, and then I said, I saw FRI and said frightened. But if you slim down the latency, if you put the mask closer and closer in time after the scared, then you get proper mask priming, and it makes all the difference. And the way they tested this was very simply. They said to subjects, here's what we want you to do now. There's going to be a prime, and we want you to avoid the words suggested by the prime. Thus, if the prime were Tuesday, we wouldn't want you to say Friday. We'd want you to say Frigidaire or something like that. So the idea is to give subjects the task of avoiding the word primed by the prime. And the fact is, you simply cannot do it. You cannot adopt the policy of avoiding frightened if the prime is well masked, that is to say, in this case here. Now, all right, this is the article if you want to look it up. It's a nice Nice article. Now, why is this important? Many people have the idea that their actions are caused by all the influences coming into their body from all over. And of course, going back to before they were born, if they're worried about determinism. And they think, well, I can't help what I say, what I do. I'm simply determined by whatever happens to me to do what I do. But here's a case where we can see a sharp distinction. If the prime is masked, indeed, you can't do anything about it. It will influence you, but you cannot adopt a policy of countering that influence because you don't know it's influencing you. You're not aware, you're not conscious of the input that you might have a policy of resisting. And this is a key to the importance of consciousness in self-control. In a way, it's sort of obvious. Consciousness allows you to do the following things. It allows you to reflect, to recount, to reconsider, to resist, to revise, to recall. All of these mental activities are possible about material of which you are conscious. This is, in fact, the strength of the so-called higher order thought theories or hot theories, such as David Rosenthal's. He says that what consciousness is what you're conscious of is what you can have a higher order thought about, to the effect that you are having that thought. And I'm going to turn it around a little bit and say you can't have higher order thoughts about contents that influence you unless you can notice them. That is to say, notice the contents in your own mind. And this is the key to the role of consciousness in self-control. Bacteria notice things. Trees notice things. They do. When taller trees start growing up around them and there's a lot of green things higher and higher, trees sense that and pour more of their energy into growing taller so they don't get shaded out by the competition. For example, even ribosomes, which are just parts of humans, of cells, of all cells, even ribosomes notice things. That is to say, they have proofreading enzymes that notice and repair mistakes. But they don't notice that they notice things. Trees don't notice that they notice things. Bacteria don't notice that they notice things. But we do. Noticing one's noticing is one of the keys to human intelligence and to self-control. Not just noticing one's noticing, but noticing one's noticing one's noticing, and so forth. This is something that we can do. When I was a child, one of the books that I remember reading was The Little Engine That Could. Some of you, especially if you're Americans, you may know this book. And the little engine that said, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can climb this hill. Now, what would be the point of thinking you can? Of course, choo-choo trains can't think that they can, but you can. And control theory provides the answer. Real choo-choo trains are controlled by engineers. Trains are fairly easy to control because they have exactly 3 degrees of freedom. stop, go, forward, back, faster, slower. The rails and the switches on the rails take care of everything else. That's why you don't have to be a rocket scientist to be an engineer. You've only got to control 3 degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom, a term from physics, but also from engineering, is a very important concept. And it fascinates me that philosophers, especially those involved in discussions of free will, have seldom made much of it, if ever. But I am saying this is a sense of freedom that's actually important for free will. Now, here's a standard diagram of degrees of freedom for something like an airplane or a drone. There's up, down, back, forward, left, right, roll, pitch, and yaw. These are all different degrees of freedom that are up for control. Now, as I say, choo-choo trains have no free will. It's perhaps worth noting that determinism is often described in terms of the railroad tracks of causation. That's a common metaphor analogy that you see in the literature, and that's a major source of distraction and misdirection, because causation and control are 2 different things. Compare a boulder bounding down a mountainside with a skier racing down a mountainside. They're both determined. The boulder is out of control. Nothing is controlling it. It's simply, things are causing it to do what it does. Every bounce is caused. Gravity is one of the main causal factors, but there's all sorts of other features of the environment that are causally responsible for the course that the boulder takes. Compare that with a skier racing down a mountainside. They're both determined. Interesting fact about that. If you were, as philosophers like to say, if you were to run the tape backwards and run it 1,000 times, the tape of causation, the boulder would always take the same course, and the skier would always take the same course. So you wouldn't be able to tell that one was in control and one of them wasn't. It's only by varying the circumstances, jiggling the circumstances, running slight variations on the tape, that's how you tell whether something is in control. You can't tell by simply running the tape exactly as it was before. If we roll boulders down the mountainside 50 times, they'll end up in a different place probably every time. We can have a skier making many runs down the slalom trail, and she may very well go down almost exactly the same track in almost exactly the same amount of time every time, because she is in control, no matter how we vary the circumstances. Of course, if she goes out of control and flies off the track, she's more like the boulder. But it isn't that determinism has taken over. Determinism is present all the time. Control is one thing, causation is another. I'm going to show you another train, Tootle. I remember this book from my childhood. And Tootle, a little golden book about the train that didn't want to stay on the rails, wanted to be free to go out, chase butterflies in the field. I did a little research on this recently and discovered that as of 2001, it was the all-time 3rd best-selling hardcover children's book in English. That's a little depressing, because if any of you know the book Tootle, you know that Tootle has to grow up and learn to stay on the rails and be a good train and not be free to cavort in the fields. So the message is, in a way, rather stark. Tootle's degrees of freedom were to be restricted, and this often makes for more reliable systems. We see this everywhere. It also creates challenges. Consider, for instance, hot air balloons. It's amazing that a hot air balloon pilot has only 1 degree of freedom to control, and that's turning the heat on or turning the heat off, raising or lowering the temperature of the air going into the hot air balloon. Heat on, off, that's it. And yet, a skilled balloon pilot, knowing about the currents of wind, can use this to navigate highly complex trajectories. I once did a balloon trip in Cappadocia in Turkey, and the balloons were going into canyons, up slopes, down other slopes, and after an hour's ride, our pilot landed our balloon on the trailer parked in a field several, 10 miles away from where we started. Immense talent, just knowing where the wind currents were and going up and down as the circumstances called for. So it's possible to get tremendous amounts of control out of a few degrees of freedom if you know what you're doing. Ricky Skaggs has a song where he says, "I can't control the wind, but I can adjust the sails." What that means is that skill is what needs to be added. You have to know how to adjust the sails. And if you can do that, if you have the requisite skill, you can be self-controlled. It doesn't depend on indeterminism at all. It depends on self-organization and feedback. What gives us our skill? It's our capacity to notice our noticing. It gives us the skill. The control power is to be reliable, autonomous agents. Some years ago, I wrote a paper called A Route to Intelligence: Oversimplify and Self-Monitor. First of all, make the task easy by oversimplifying the systems that are controlling your basic motions, your walking, your lifting, your moving your body around, and then self-monitor the results and tweak them when they need to be by noticing your noticings, by seeing what you're doing. Now, here's the catch. Consciousness allows us to be too good at noticing our noticing. Too good at noticing our noticing. And that leads to the paralysis of Hamlet, who gets so wound up in his thoughts and his reflections that he can't act. This is a phenomenon we're all familiar with, I think especially philosophers. It leads to the debilitating kind of self-consciousness. It's interesting that self-consciousness has this negative sense where you become so unable not to attend to features of your own reactions that it brings you to a stumbling halt. This is the price we pay for our otherwise magnificent capacity, unparalleled in any other species, to notice our noticing. Way back in 1970, Richard Rorty published an influential paper called Incorrigibility as the Mark of the Mental. And paraphrasing slightly, his message was that a mind is a control system whose self-reports cannot be overridden by third-person evidence. That is, if you want to know what it's doing, ask it. It's the best authority on what it's doing and why. he was not saying that we are infallible or that we are certain in our knowledge of what we're doing. It's just that we're in a better position than anyone else to say what we think we're doing. And this is a two-edged sword. If we find a person whose self-reports can be overridden, we deny it a mind. And we do find such people. There are people with brain damage, people who are senile, who have dementia, and they've lost this privilege of incorrigibility, which is the standard presumption of human sociality. If you want to know what somebody wants to eat, ask them. If you want to know what they want to do next, ask them. And treat their responses as authoritative. You get to say. Of course, you may choose to lie. But if you're not lying, then your source, you are, in a certain sense, which I would defend in a longer paper and have, you are constitutionally the best source of information about the content of your own thoughts. But this is something you have to achieve. Infants don't have it. An excellent recent book by the Israeli linguist Daniel Dor called The Instruction of Imagination is very good at looking at the process, the way in which we have to teach children how to tell us what's in their minds. We need to learn how to express our thoughts. Once we've learned this, we enter the community of minds. We become persons whose words are granted a kind of authority. It's rather like the authority of a novelist. We don't ask Dickens, how do you know that Scrooge was so miserly? He's the novelist, he gets to say. And you're the person, you get to say what it's like to be you. You can, of course, spin fables, tell falsehoods if you want to. But if you don't, you just can say. You get to say what it's like to be you, but you don't have any first-person authority about how you achieve this status. That's the point that goes back to the beginning of my talk, where I said, you don't know what's going on between your ears, in your head, in your brain, that permits you to be able to tell us. You don't know how it is that you can tell us what you think. You just can. Now, this is where philosophers create problems for themselves when they stop with the first-person point of view. They marvel at this fact. They come up with introspective armchair theories about how it is that you can do this, and they invent special kinds of direct acquaintance with properties such as qualia and so forth. But that's all just armchair theorizing. They do not know, you do not know how it is that you can tell us what you think. Right now, look at me, I guess, or look at the screen and realize that you can say what you see. How do you do that? You don't know. There's just as much machinery involved in being able to do that as there is in the inbound path from your eyeball to your visual cortex and beyond. Now, there has to be a subpersonal explanation of this ability from the third person point of view. This is where armchair philosophy just bottoms out on this topic. Let me pause and put it this way to the believers in qualia, to the believers in dualism or panpsychism. Suppose you're right. Suppose that qualia have a special physical status if you're that kind of qualia lover, or if you're a panpsychist, some other status. You still have to tell the subpersonal explanation of how you get from those features, whatever you say they are, to the fact that you can tell us, you can move your lips, words can come out of your mouth that you endorse, that you claim are an accurate, articulate expression of your beliefs about how it is with you, what it's like to be you. You can't evade the obligation to have a theory of how that's possible, and it's going to have to be a third-person point of view theory. It's going to have to be a subpersonal explanation of the machinery in the brain that does it. It isn't magic. I want to talk a bit about a problem that this raises. Wonder if you've thought of this. Why are most experiments in psychology about perception and not about voluntary action? And why are most experiments in psycholinguistics about comprehension, not expression? There's a very good reason. The experimental method requires controlling the inputs and measuring the outputs. A good experiment requires, first of all, that I'm talking about experiments with human subjects. First, you brief the subject. You tell the subject, here's what I want you to do. I want you to stare ahead at the little cross. I want you to put your fingers on these buttons. And then when you see what you see, I want you to press this button for this result, this button for that other result, and so forth. So you brief the subjects. And you want to make sure that they're naive subjects. That is to say, you don't let them know what you hope to find out, because that will put an almost irresistible pressure on them to either help you or thwart you in their responses. You've got to keep them in the dark about what hypothesis you're testing. And also, of course, you should include non-weird subjects. That is weird, the term from Joe Henrich for Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic people. Most psychology experiments up to very recently were almost entirely done with, university students in countries like America and England and France and Germany. And the generalizations from those subjects turn out often to be mistaken. You should also make sure that you run experiments on a cross-section of people in other cultures from around the world. Often you find there's a huge difference. But that's another hobby horse of mine. We'll leave that aside. For now, it's very important that your subjects be naive. Compare, for instance, the task of the psychologist with the task of the chemist. The chemist doesn't have to tiptoe around in the lab and can talk openly about what she's trying to find out because the chemicals can't pay attention, can't understand, can't be affected by what she says. Human subjects can. That's why you have to go to this extra trouble. And so what you do in a good experiment is you clamp as many degrees of freedom as possible. How do you do this? You do this by A, not telling them what you want to find out, B, telling them what you want them to do, and removing all sources of distraction. You want to get subjects to create little software mechanisms that are temporary and adjustable and screen off all sources of distraction, reconsideration, and so forth. My colleague Ray Jackendoff writes in one of his books, I can't remember which one, that it's actually quite easy for a psychologist to set up human subjects to do one of these simple tests, a psychophysical test or a perceptual test. You give them a 5-minute briefing on what you want, you give them a few practice trials, and then they'll do it highly reliably. What you've done is set up a little app in their head, which is temporary and adjustable, and they will just let that app rip and give you a lot of data. But what you're doing is clamping many degrees of freedom in order to get this. Now, if you want to do the same experiment with, say, monkeys or cats or dogs, you may have to do thousands of training trials to get the animal to exhibit the reliable behavior in the circumstances that you're looking for. That is a huge difference between people and other animals. You can get a person, because of our tremendous capacity for self-control, you can get a person to set themselves up in a particular way and then play whatever game it is you want them to play, following all the rules that you've told them, because they can understand the rules. Let's just look at an experiment I've talked about many times, a series of experiments. Let's look at shepherd figures, Roger Shepard's lovely work from, 40 years ago. Look at these two cube assemblies and decide whether they are different orientations of the same shape. And then press the button on the left if the answer is yes, the button on the right if the answer is no. I think everybody can see that this is a task which is a little bit demanding. And Shepard very carefully did not tell people how to do this, just wanted them to answer the question, are these the same shape or not? And then what he did was he plotted the latency, the time it took them to answer the questions. And he discovered that it took them longer to answer the questions, measured in milliseconds, when they had to rotate one of the figures more degrees to see if it coincided. In other words, he had the computer draw pictures that were 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees, 120 degrees is what you'd have to turn to get them to line up. And he found quite remarkably good results which suggested that when people said that they were rotating the one on the left to see if it coincided with the one on the right, it was something, maybe they were right about that. Maybe they were rotating images in their mind's eye. This led to decades-long controversy about what was actually going on, but it was a good experiment, and it was the basis of a lot of other good experiments. So good experiments systematically conceal or ignore one of the most important features of human consciousness, that it has innumerable degrees of freedom. A flip-flop in a computer, has 1 degree of freedom, on or off, 0 or 1. And the control of degrees of freedom is always an issue. A degree of freedom is an opportunity for control. In other words, if you're working with the system, or if the system could be your own hand, and you have a degree of freedom, you can control it, clamp it, or let it run free at your peril. A nice example that Rod Brooks drew to my attention years ago when we were working on the COG robot project is, as anybody who does any sewing knows, threading a needle is a pretty tricky thing to do. And one of the things that really helps is if you hold the needle in one hand and press your hand against the tabletop or against some solid surface. So you clamp that degree of freedom, and you've got the needle in a device where it won't move, and then you can concentrate on getting the end of the thread through the eye, because you don't have to worry about the degrees of freedom that you'd otherwise have to control in your other hand. So clamping of degrees of freedom is a way of simplifying the world for yourself. It's also, of course, what psychologists have to do to simplify the world so that they can run experiments. So any degree of freedom, there's only 3 things you can do with it. You can clamp it one way or another. You can devote attention, information processing, feedback, etc., to control it, or you can just let it run free. Take your chances. Many of you will recognize this wonderful picture of consciousness by Saul Steinberg, which I've used for many purposes, and I'm going to use it for a slightly different one today. So here's the fellow, he's looking at the painting, he identifies it as a Braque, and then his stream of consciousness is off and running. And it's this sort of wonderful stream of consciousness. One thing reminds him of another, and he's really into this long and fascinating set of associations. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. The man walks out of the room and walks back in and looks at the Braque again. What can happen? And the answer is almost anything can happen. Very unlikely that exactly the same stream of consciousness will occur to him. There may be elements that are the same, but it might spin off in any one of hundreds, no thousands, no millions of different directions. There's just no end of the way that somebody could be moved to reflect on looking at that painting. That's the degrees of freedom that our conscious minds have. Almost anything can happen. Janan Ismail says persons are dynamical wild cards. This is a book that everybody interested in free will should read, since it nicely distinguishes determinism, shows how determinism and free will are compatible. The bottom line of her account is to be free is to be able to make decisions on your own behalf, nothing more and nothing less. To be able to make decisions on your own behalf. That is to have the skill to marshal relevant information, notice it, know that you're noticing it, and use that as the basis of the decision making you do. Some people in AI are talking about making autonomous AI humanoids that will then go walking around the country doing things, helping us in various ways and so forth. But if they're really that autonomous, if they're really self-controlled, they'd be pretty dangerous. But look, we're pretty dangerous. We're dynamical wildcards, as she says, Janan Ismail says. What makes us safe is that we've learned how to be moved by reasons. It's our ability to be moved by reasons that people can reason with us and tell us, here's why I don't want you to do that. And this can be very general. It can be part of what we learn when we're growing up. Consider, for instance, the familiar policy, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, why not? Ignorance of the law would be a good excuse if laws were not made public. I didn't know that was against the law. Nobody told me. There's no sign that said that was against the law. Well, we don't plant signs all over the place, but we do make an effort to publicize the laws that we do have. And then we can expect people, we can oblige people to pay attention and to be moved by these reasons. Only if the state publicizes the law so that people can notice it and respond to it with some measure of control, then we can obligate people to pay attention to the law. And that's why ignorance of the law is no excuse. Now, this is very familiar stuff, but it is key to understanding the relationship between self-control, freedom of the will, and moral responsibility. It's because we can obligate people to pay attention to the law if they have the skills. That's why they're suitable candidates for punishment, because they can understand in advance that the price they're paying for their freedom to move about as they will is that they will pay penalties if they break the laws. But now back to consciousness. How do we get from subpersonal states in the brain and events that have unconscious content to personal level states and events whose contents are manifest somehow to the person? This is the hard question to me. Now, I have made an effort working with a colleague to sketch out what might be a solution to this. And that's Bryce Huebner, a picture of Bryce, not just a colleague, but also a crew member on my sailboat, Xantippe, back when I was racing. And Bryce and I wrote a paper called Banishing I and We from Accounts of Metacognition. The title, I think, says a lot. This is a response to a paper in BBS, Behavior and Brain Sciences, by Peter Carruthers, which is a wonderful paper, but it still has first-person pronouns at various points where you have to go subpersonal and try to get to the machinery that underlies our capacity to do this. We propose a category of events that occur in the brain that we call blurts. this is in part inspired by some work by Ray Jackendoff. Schematically, a conceptualized thought triggers the production of a linguistic representation that approximates the content of that thought, yielding a reflexive blurt. In other words, want to think of a process that is automatized, basically stupid, sort of an obsessive blabbermouth process that's always trying to put thoughts into words. It doesn't know that's what it's doing, but that's what it's doing. It's blurting out candidates for expression. Such linguistic blurts are proto-speech acts, issuing subpersonally. You don't even know they're going on in you. Not yet from or by the person, and they are either sent to exogenous broadcast systems, where they become the raw material for personal speech acts, or they endogenously broadcast to language comprehension systems, which feed directly into the mind reading system. In other words, we create recursive loops where this obsessive blurt maker blurts out all kinds of stuff, some of it valuable, some of it on target, some of it not. This then gets fed back into language comprehension systems, which accept or reject it, and it gets refined or discarded. So we have a generate and test process at the subpersonal level that you yourself really know nothing about. If you say, well, that doesn't happen in me, you don't know that doesn't happen in you. Maybe it does, and maybe that's how it is that you are able to say what it's like to be you, able to form and issue personal speech acts from the personal level that describe what it's like to be you. Blurts are tested to see whether they should be uttered overtly, as the mind reading system accesses the content of the blurt and reflexively generates a belief that approximates the content of that blurt. Systems dedicated to belief fixation are then recruited, beliefs are updated, the blurt is accepted or rejected, and the process repeats. Proto-linguistic blurts, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, dress system one outputs in mentalistic clothing, facilitating system-level metacognition. In other words, this is how you get to notice your noticings and be able to say what you're noticing. All of this happens without your having access to the details of the process. Is our blurt theory proven? No, it's hardly even tested. It's just an idea, but some such theory is needed. And it is needed to replace the fantasies of philosophers. Every year for a bunch of years on edge.org, John Brockman set what was called the world question. And this has now had its last edition. And the last question was the final collection of these. And here was the question that I submitted. How can an aggregation of trillions of selfish, myopic cells discover the unwitting teamwork that turns that dynamic clump into a person who can love, notice, wonder, and keep a promise? That's the question I would like to work on. It's the question that many people now are working on. And I think it is, by a country mile, a better question to consider than the meta problem of consciousness. I see I'm running maybe a little late, but I want to say a little bit about my friend Sam Harris and his book, Free Will. Harris asks at one point in the book, where is the freedom in doing what one wants when one's desires are the product of prior events that one is completely unaware of and had no hand in creating? Well, that's a rhetorical question, but it's one that should be answered. And in fact, one does have a prior hand in creating many of the desires because one notices one's own noticings. But I want to draw attention to one of the implications of the view I'm maintaining here. I wrote a rather critical piece about his book because of, wait a minute, let's see, where am I in my slides here? I want to go back here. I objected to the cover of this book with free will hanging from puppet strings, and wrote a critique of Sam's book, to which he wrote a rebuttal, which is online if you want to see it. And in that rebuttal, he says a puppet is free as long as it loves its strings. Now let's see if that's true. So there's the cover of the book with the puppet strings. Let's consider this wonderful illustration that I found on the web. A puppet controlling a puppet, controlling a puppet, controlling a puppet, controlling a puppet. Conceptually possible, but practically impossible. There's absolutely no way that the smallest puppet there could do anything other than just flop around hopelessly, because the control system problem are just too great. Control requires feedback. The feedback has to be accurate and it has to be swift. The reason why Perseverance was autonomous when it arrived at Mars is because Mars was too far away to be controlled, for Perseverance to be controlled by the controllers, the puppeteers back on Earth. Even if you're using radio signals, the problems of speed are too great for feedback. So this is a interesting but impossible figure. But how about this one? This is not impossible. It's not the best way to control your legs, but it's quite possible for an auto puppet to control its own legs by controlling its own strings with its arms. In fact, some disabled people, paraplegics and so forth, have sophisticated variants of this which permit them to get around. It's all a matter of controlling the degrees of freedom. The task that every organism faces at every minute is, what do I do now? But for us, it's more difficult because we have the task of what do I think now? And we can think just about anything. We have all those degrees of freedom, and we can't control them all at once. I was recently treated to a definition of intelligence, which I love to reflect on, writing about this now. Piaget once said, intelligence is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. When you're confronted with a novel situation for which you have no training, for which you have no prior experience, if you're intelligent, you know how to direct your thoughts, you know how to problem solve, you know how to think about what to do when you don't know what to do. This is both, I think, an elegant definition of what intelligence is and the key to understanding self-control. There's my fellow looking at the Brach again. Consider the different degrees of control that you can exercise. There's mind wandering, like that man looking at the Brach. Then you can get stuck in obsessive compulsive repetition, or you can find yourself fighting distraction, as probably many of you are right now, trying to pay attention to me. Or there's rapt attention to a problem. These are different degrees of control you can exercise. You can exercise. It's a skill. And some people are better at than others. Self-control is an art, not an algorithm. There are too many degrees of freedom for it to be subject to a simple algorithmic solution. So the biggest threat to our freedom is the attempt of others to pull our strings. So love your strings and protect them, and you will have all the self-control you want and all the free will worth wanting. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much.